Hi, everyone. I'm with old friend Danny Goldberg, and Danny hasn't been around here in a while. Danny of Rock and Rolls, Roles, that great podcast that we had on, but Danny did for a while. Hi, Danny.
Hey, Raghu.
Uh, Danny went on to become a famous author, which he's been doing for many years, but this latest book that he put out has piqued the interest across the world of people, press, and everything, right?
Well, it's a memoir of working with Kurt Cobain, the singer from Nirvana. So he's so beloved around the world that I was able to get this book published in like a dozen different languages. It's all a tribute to Kurt, but hopefully when people read it, they'll think I'm a decent writer.
Yeah, no, listen, I got to tell you that for these podcasts, I usually go in and I'll pick out a thing here and there. I got to run through the book because, got too much going on, whatever. But this one, I don't know why even, it was more page burner kind of thing. In other words, I kept flipping the page. Maybe it's all, so it is well written, Danny. And of course, that's a truism through all of the books that you've written, and I've enjoyed them. But in this particular case, since we kind of renewed well, as far as you're concerned, started our friendship and other relationship business wise in the early 90s after you just had left, a couple of years after you left management, left Gold Man. So,
Right. No, it covers a time in my life when you and I were not in as close touch, for
yeah,
sure. And it's fun to me that it's filled in that. But yeah, that's
yeah. So everybody knows. I think we probably have talked about this before, but because of the subject matter and certainly the intensity of what was going on in the music business at the time, and your um, long time, I mean the long time evolvement of a really quite amazing career that you've had. And so just to connect the dots, so Danny and I, actually, Danny, we met I was with Krishnas. We were having lunch at this cafe where we did our first jazz record for Triloka on the Sunset Grill. Used to go to lunch there, I think. So there you were. I have no idea, but we were introduced at that point. Remember, we met you, in the Hilda days, which was some 20.
remember the Hilda days. Obviously, I associate that more with New York because I guess Hilda was in L.A. one one time. I remember when I was there, but generally speaking, I
It was
associate
all New York, yeah.
Hilda Charlton with New York City, and that was such a. She's a spiritual teacher that I learned about from Ram Dass,
Mm.
and ended up deeply, deeply touching me and opened my heart to the whole idea of love in connection with God, as opposed to
A path.
more intellectual or a thing. It just
Yeah.
I still she passed on in 1989, I think 88 or 89. I think about her still every single day, and the atmosphere around her was so kind of lovey, and I just my memory of that is all blurred into a big kind of pink, well,
Fluffy cloud. Yeah.
it's uh, it's so great to have different levels to connect at. God knows well, day-to-day life tends to go by very quickly. So
Yeah. 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 So, all right. So here's what happened, everybody. So, actually, Krishnanas and I started a label named Triloka, and David Silver and we've done some podcasts. You want to hear some of that music way in the beginning days of Mindrolling. But at one point, so this all happened. Danny left Gold Mountain, his agency, management group that was basically, handled Kurt Cobain, uh, but at some point, you decide, and this is after Nirvana became huge, right? You decided, to take up an opportunity to go into the label business?
Yeah, I had a personal management company. It was called Gold Mountain, and we had some wonderful artists. Nirvana became the most successful one, just the biggest act in the world at that time. Rock, anyway. Had Bonnie Raitt for the record that she won her Grammys for, and the Allman Brothers. But I was running a small business. My daughter, my first kid, my daughter Katie, had just been born, and the stress of running a small business and the travel that management involved was just not appealing to me. And I got offered an executive job at Atlantic Records, and I felt that I could, if I stayed there for a year or two, I could become president. It just that was the glow of having worked with Nirvana was such a big deal in the music business at that time.
Mm.
And that bet paid off. I was made president a year later, and but because of the relationship I developed with Kurt, and the quirky arrangement of the people around the band, I ended up staying as one of the managers of Nirvana till he died. Uh, and my role was to deal with him. My ex partner John Silver, who today is an incredibly successful with the Foo Fighters and many other people. Um, dealt with the other guys in the band and with a lot of the logistics of the management. But there were constantly kind of personal issues that came up, and because of the way the relationships that it evolved, he wanted me to play that role. So
Mhm.
I from Atlantic, a lot of there's when I was researching the book, I found these memos written to Kurt and to Courtney Love, his wife, on Atlantic Stationery. We'd have meetings at Atlantic, even though Nirvana was on a competing label on Geffen Records. It didn't matter. It was all about kind of the personal connectivity. So yeah, I had kind of two jobs for a while.
Mm.
Same as now.
Yeah.
Too
Yeah,
small.
right. That's right. You may have more than 2 now. Uh, this person I was, your job was to handle what you call what? The personality issues, perhaps?
Well, there were personal issues that that he just wanted me. He wanted to talk to me about. You know, when it was just about there were certain aspects, management, which are logistical and planning tour, interview schedule, and those kind of things. The old office would do that, but anything that was personally important to him, and
Mm.
for better or for worse, most for worse, a lot of dramas that came up, and so I stayed involved.
Mm. Yeah, and if you read this book, of course, because of this, Danny had tremendous insights as to the complexity of the character of Kurt and the issues that he had. And this book really connects with all of that in a way that I don't think people have really. I mean, there's been other biographies of him and Nirvana and all, but this is a unique view. Anyhow, back to my story. I want to talk about me.
Good.
Uh, so so Danny jumps and he's at Atlantic, and then something happens. Music business. One day is one thing, and some new blah blah comes in the head of it and decides to sweep the floor, so to speak. Anyhow, so Danny ends up at Polygram running Mercury, and hires David Silver, my erstwhile podcast partner. And although at that time, and Danny, to me, you were the guy that I bumped into at Hilda's place, right? That's my memory of you. We really didn't communicate very much. You don't even remember, but I do remember you there. Maybe it was around Led Zeppelin because Danny was publicist for Led Zeppelin, worked with them for some time. And I had had this experience running a radio station in Montreal with Led Zeppelin that was kind of embarrassing. And I think I've told you many years later. Did I tell you that story of?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, with my brother cursing out the Led Zeppelin, and I had to go over and apologize to Robert Plant about that. Um, but so for this is my total connection with you. And David says, "You know what? Danny really kind of likes the stuff that you're doing." And at that time, Christian Us was just coming out and starting to do chant records. And, we had some interesting stuff on the world, more to the world music side. And he said, why don't you just come in and let's talk about this? Anyhow, long and the short of it was that Danny offered a partnership and financing for Triloka, the label. And so there I was, then doing bi-coastal back and forth because Danny, by that time, you would move back to New York. And so this is the tenor of the conversation, just so everybody knows kind of what happened. I'd say, Danny, I kind of, what do you think kind of budget I can have for this year with the, is X amount of artists and this and that? He said, come up with a budget. We'll look at it and we'll see. So I got very expansive. I felt very expansive in that conversation. And I came up with a budget that was way beyond what a world music record company should have gotten. Danny, he doesn't even call. He signs off on it. And next thing I know, here's your approved budget. It was like I had gone to that pink, fluffy cloud place, So this was one aspect. So, things evolved and years passed and Danny moved on, we moved on. But then at a certain point in the early 2000s, Danny was running Artemis Records. And he had some partners and financing, and I was back in the same position of needing more financing. And he said, okay, we'll do it. But it was a lot more constrained. So I'm going to tell an inside joke, Danny. One day I went to you and said, I got this really great group. Yeah, as you know, whoever they were. But I really need, we could use another like 50 grand in marketing money to really make this thing happen. It'll make our whole year, right? You know what you said to me? What do I look like? Your father? Do you remember that?
No.
Oh God, why do I always remember that?
It's
what do I look like? Daddy Warbucks here?
Well, the business, but look, my own stat, I've had a good, interesting ride, but it depends, when there's money, when you're hot, you're hot. When you're not, you're not. So when I was hot, we had a lot of luck at Mercury with some big pop.
Yeah.
Hanson records sold like 11 million records. So there was so much, and in the corporate world, you're obligated to reach certain budgetary targets, and if you know that you're going to millions of dollars ahead of that, it's like you could play with it. And so there were a lot of. That's when I made Allen Ginsberg's last record.
Yeah,
With Triloka. We made a Spalding Gray record. David Silver, by the way, was involved in all of these projects because his role was to be involved with the things that I had an emotional connection to. And then I had another part of my job, which was just to make money and to deal with whatever the commercial considerations were, which was not so. But David also had this incredible personality that he could just connect with any artist. So I always could trust him in any situation. So we were able to do it there. Then years later, in the Artemis situation, I have a much more limited budgets, and depending on which year it was, they became incredibly limited, and the company eventually went bankrupt. It was started just at the beginning of the decline of the record business, when the financial decline, when the digital world started eroding, the value of recordings. So, it depends. When some days $50,000 is nothing, and some days it's like an unbelievable fortune.
Yeah, right.
And that's just the way it is. I mean, when there's a lot, you don't think about it. When there's a little, you think about every penny.
Yeah, right. Anyhow, it was a fun moment, and I was thinking about it as the juxtaposition from the time that we first started and then into the early 2000s when everything changed, of course. So one thing that's poignant in the book, actually, of course, is the addiction.
Yeah.
It's really tough, and I found myself constantly going, Jesus, what possibly? I mean, you all tried everything, interventions, the whole 9 yards. What possibly could have been said? And nothing could have been said. And that is sort of the horror of it all. It just, I don't know where it comes from, where somebody actually goes to the 12-step program and commits. I've got a lot of friends who've done that, and they've committed and they've stayed there, and it's worked for them. But yeah, tell me a little bit about what you felt was behind this with him.
Well, I don't know what any answers about why some people. The question you just raised is the unknowable question. Firstly, why some people become addicted and some don't. A lot of it, as far as I can understand, is almost genetic, because it does run in families, drug addiction, alcoholism. And I, when I was a young 17-year-old, did heroin and methadone and every drug I could get my hands on at that time. And by the grace of God, I didn't become addicted. I became crazy and needed to stop and get some help, but I didn't become addicted. Other people become addicted, very quickly. The human brain, different. So um, I had been around by the time I worked with Nirvana. When I met Kurt, I was 40 and he was in his early 20s. I had been already in the music business for 20 years. Like you said, I'd worked with Zeppelin. I'd been around people with drug problems. And I was very anti-drug in my personal life by this time because of seeing the damage it did for people. And but we found, a lot of us, about 4 months or so after Nevermind came out, which was the album that made Nirvana almost overnight the biggest rock band in the world, based initially on that song "Smells Like Teen Spirit." When they did Saturday Night Live, there had been a couple of articles that implied he was doing heroin, and then I went to the set, and it was just clear, and we all just knew that day. It was a bunch of people who worked with the band. Kind of, that was the day we all realized, oh, this is an extremely serious problem.
Mm,
So we did
mhm.
an intervention a couple of weeks later, and talked him and Courtney into going to rehab. This is all in the book, and he struggled for the rest of his life. He lived several more years and he was clean for a while. Then he would do heroin again, and then he was clean again. And sometimes, junkies tend to lie about this sort of thing. So always know just because someone said he was clean, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. He didn't take the 12 steps. Some people extremely close to me have had their lives saved by this 12 steps. I'm a great
Yeah.
advocate of it, but it's not for everybody. It's just one of those things. It doesn't work for everybody. Everybody doesn't get drawn into it. And all you can do is love somebody and introduce them to every possible uh, therapy that you can think of or find out about. Again, in my experience, 12 steps has by far been the most, but other people, it's meditation. Some people just get an epiphany. I think John Coltrane, I read just one day, just said, I'm done, and just locked himself in a room, got clean, and was clean for the rest of his life. Not
Mm,
people can do that. Uh,
mm,
Kurt couldn't, nor did he like 12 steps. So it haunted his life, and
mm,
it's no different. The emotional reality of loving somebody who's an alcoholic or drug addict is no different whether they're a rock star or whether they're have any other kind of a job. It's not about fame. It's not about talent. It's a separate lane in the human experience. And it's painful to love somebody who's an addict. There's no question about it, and
mm,
you just have to do the best you can. But
yeah.
ultimately, not responsible for someone else's behavior. You can only be responsible for your own.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me though was the his kindness. There's a lot of incidents in the book that you described where he stopped for people that weren't necessarily going to help him on the ladder, quote unquote.
Oh yeah, no, he was such a beautiful guy. It's not everyone who is very talented is a nice person. Uh, you know, Again, those two separate parts of the human personality. And a lot of very talented people who one can admire, who wouldn't necessarily say that they're nice. But when I was doing the book, I called a bunch of people who knew Kurt around the same time I did. I was trying to reconstruct things, and memory, as you and I just were discussing earlier, is not so reliable, especially my own. So it was great to talk to other people, and everybody had a story about Kurt's kindness. He was just a beautiful guy. His darkness was
Mm,
all directed at himself, not to other people in
mm,
my experience. And I tell a story. And do you mind if I just kind of
No, riff away.
Away, because I'm happy to slow it down. But I tell a story in the book where after he died, um, you know, uh, we went up. My family went up to Seattle for the funeral a couple of days later, and we get picked up by a driver, and it's a woman driver, and she says, "Are you here for the funeral?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah." And she said, "I drove him. I drove Kurt." I said, "Oh, far out." And she said, "Yeah, it was just a few months ago." And I told him, my son loved Nirvana and loved him so much. My son's 14. And I was telling him that, and he said, "Well, where do you live?" And I told him, and it was not far from where he lived. It was on the way. And so he said, Let's stop at your house. I'll say hi to your son." And she said, "No, no, no, no." She said, "No, no, I want to meet him." So she stops at her house, goes, gets her son. Son comes out. He shakes his hand. She said, and he looked at my son and he said to him, "Your mom's a really great driver." And then they drove off. And so we're all weeping, including her and all of us, with this story. But that was his day to day life. He didn't know she was ever going to tell anyone that story. That was he was a sweetheart, beautiful, beautiful guy, incredible genius. Emotionally damaged, tough childhood, but somebody I really, really loved, and I just try to. I had a particular relationship with him. It was one of his managers. It was mostly in the context of the business. I didn't do drugs with him. I didn't make music with him. I can only describe the part of him that I knew. Like a lot of these genius types, he had a lot of different parts of him, and I only saw the parts that he let me see. But it's a different perspective than a journalistic one, like the other books that you're saying. And I did the best I could with it. It's a funny thing how what is art? We talk about spirituality, and then we talk about our day to day life, and how art fits into this. I mean, I know you and I have talked about this in the past, but where does it fit? It's somewhere in between heaven and earth, right?
It's a bridge.
Yeah,
It's a bridge.
can be.
And yeah, it can be if it really is transforming. I mean, and
Art or the Beatles, or in my
yep,
opinion, Cobain. It's a bridge. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. I mean, and we've all had that experience, especially being so in love with music and making it, a career. Uh, we've both had that experience. For me, it was, I tell this story a billion times, John Coltrane,
right.
and seeing him live. I just was telling this to another musician the other day in a podcast, seeing him live at 16 years old. So my friend who I did the podcast with, his name was East Forest. He said, "Well, what song did he play?" And I said, "My favorite things." And he went, "Oh my God, you saw John Coltrane play My Favorite Things live?"
That is amazing.
It is. And it is what happened. I was transformed in that moment. I mean, I actually went out. I didn't know, I had no words for what happened. I just felt completely absorbed beyond any kind of thinking, time and space, right? And I got to tell you this. I've been, something like I tell everybody. The other day, in the last 4 or 5 days, somehow I got a link on, how you get these links, social media, whatever, YouTube, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, live at the Olympia Theater in 1960 in Paris. Okay. Fantastic. First solo is by Miles, as usual. And then Coltrane does a solo. And I tell you, I got completely absorbed again through this thing that he does that nobody else does. I mean, except the likes of a Hendrix, that kind of instrumentalist.
Yeah.
And then I thought, oh shit, I thought I've been bullshitting myself all these years. Coltrane, yeah, I went, like it was an intellectualization, and I had lost the visceral thing of it. And then I got it back through just, I'll send it to you. It's
It's
phenomenal.
funny. I saw last night. There's a new documentary about David Crosby.
Mm,
Well, Crosby, Remember My Name, and it basically consists mostly of interviews Cameron Crowe did with Crosby, and then some old footage. It's very incredibly honest and naked, and I think quite a good documentary. But in it, he talks about Coltrane a lot and how almost his experience
Really?
similar to yours of what the impact that Coltrane made on him, and he got to know Coltrane a little bit, but it's just funny. Twice in 2 days, uh,
Mm.
and to hear about how music that was heard 50 or 60 years ago still matters in
Yeah.
today, and
Yeah.
that's another amazing thing.
Yeah.
Because you think about what else was happening in 1960. I don't know what was on television. I don't know. I know that was the year John Kennedy ran for president, was elected, so it's an iconic year for that. But other than that, I don't know anything that was happening in 1960. But we know that music is
Mm.
still in the moment of
Mm.
relevance to you, and everything else from 1960 is like really perceptible,
La Americana.
even
Something.
knowable. Forget
Yeah.
about
Right.
having any intensity.
Right.
Unless
Right.
you go and research it, you're not going to even have it at the tip of your mind. And no one's sending a link to anything else from 1960.
Yeah.
But
Right.
music.
You know, the other redemption I had, I have to tell you about in music, it was Bob Dylan. That Scorsese thing,
The-
Rolling Thunder.
I was hoping you would bring this up. Yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, I hated Dylan because of what he did to me when he went through that Elvis phase, and he was like, he changed every melody and every rhythm pattern of every song, and it was awful, and he killed me. And from then on, I was really hurt because he meant so much to me when I was 15, 16. And in this thing, which he did in 1975, I was riveted, Danny, by
The live
every
footage is mind blowing.
mind blowing. Absolutely.
It's some of the best live footage I've ever seen. I was talking a couple of years ago to KD about Dylan, and he said, when a new Dylan album came out, it wasn't just an album. He was telling us how to think.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
We
yeah.
were looking for how to think about being alive. And it is just a weird thing. Other than Shakespeare, I mean, there's a small list of artists that penetrate that deeply. Yeah, I was so mesmerized. I was waiting and waiting for it to come on Netflix, and the first day it was on, I saw it, and it just blew my mind. Particularly the live footage. There are things about it that are a little odd.
Yeah, yeah, the actual doc has some weird shit, but it's the live footage.
That didn't work. That's sort of 20% of it, but the other 80% of it, of the document of that time is just up there with.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Hey, I can't, I have to ensue here with a little discussion of what's going on, because I count on you for some real skillful wisdom around what's going on politically and socially. Okay,
Yeah.
so what happened is, so I'm going to read a little of something, and we can talk about it. But somebody wrote to Ram Dass, and I've asked him if he's cool about me talking about it, and said a few things that were prompted by Ram Dass saying on a podcast where he was talking about Trump and how to love him and recognize he's in this incarnation. He's got this karma to work out. And, what we need to do is just connect with his soul. And if I was with him, I remember he said this to me, if I was with him, I'd really kind of, help him along here to understand that, get a little bit of a different perspective. And he said, you also talked about how dark the world is at the moment, more so than you saw in the 60s. So he says, with the internet, I think we have given form to our collective mind. Our consciousnesses are now all connected across the world, and we are beginning to see that we are like cells in a giant brain, universal mind. Don, I have I have begun to appreciate that Donald Trump's role, and he also mentions Boris Johnson, who just now is the Premier of England, and almost identical figure, is their role is to act as catalysts for us to see our collective mind. Everyone's frustrated with them because they are not taking it all seriously. They're not playing the game, and they are saying it is fake news and dealing with it as if it is. They are they're like old style court jesters in Shakespeare's day who take over the throne when the king has become lost in taking himself too seriously and in folly. They talk gibberish, but their role is to wake us up. What I realized is Trump is waking us up to our collective, quote unquote, mind chatter. We are stuck believing the media is providing us with the truth, but it is not. It is providing us, like our own minds, with subjective opinions fueled by drama. I had never questioned things like the BBC before Trump. I had assumed they gave me the quote unquote truth. So I reflected that if they did not give me the truth, what was the truth? It came to me that the truth was I didn't know. I had no idea.
Just
Uh,
is
yeah,
Ramdas saying this or someone saying?
no.
Ram?
This is someone who's writing to Ramdas and posing this.
Got it. Got it.
What do you think so far, in terms of?
Bring it. I finish it and then I'll.
Okay, all right. It's long, but everybody have some patience.
I'm into it.
I think that is the role of a Trump or a Boris. Can we love them? More importantly, can we laugh? I watch what a fantastic foil they are for our self-righteousness and anger. And I do love that is so true. It's beyond true. Everyone is so sure they are the bad guys and we are the good guys. Not only that, but they are highlighting our hubris. We are so sure we know what is best that we have forgotten that we are not in control of life and that it is perfect, but it does not conform to our notions of how it should be. I remember all your wonderful stories about Maharaji and your rascally friends undermining your wonderful plans and ideas about how it should be, like a friend coming in with muddy boots and treading all over your white carpet. Trump is certainly a rascally friend. I am not condoning his actions or suggesting irresponsibility or that it is not right to take action against what he is doing, but rather that we are not there to change him, but rather to be changed by him. When you consider the fact that there has never, this is something you've said to me, less war, less poverty, less violence, more international sense of connectedness, why do we not feel that we are living in a golden age? I think it is like the pressure or crisis before a breakthrough in consciousness, like a collective long, dark night of the soul. I also recognize what is pointing at it is that our collective mind chatter is not a reflection of reality, nor are the emotions it produces. I think we are being asked to develop a witness that can stand back from identifying with it all and open our hearts and minds wider. I also, when he goes on to talk about the environment, that the current crisis is waking us up to the fact that the earth is our collective body, just as Trump is waking us up to our collective mind. Yet again, all we know for certain is that there is change. Whether we think that is a good thing or a bad thing is an emotional, subjective viewpoint. We are stuck thinking we know how it should all be and how it will be. But that is an illusion. We don't know. We thought in the 80s it would definitely be destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. Coming up to the year 2000, we were certain the whole world would melt down because of the Y2K bug. Many believe in Nostradamus' predictions and so on. I am not suggesting or advocating that we do not take action, but that the crisis we face is there to wake us up collectively. And it goes on from there. I recognize, he says, that we need every point of view. We need a right and a left, in the same way that we need a right and left hemisphere in our brains. The creative tensions of these oppositions create consciousness. The left's truth is compassion and care for others. Its shadow is self-righteousness, dependency, and the drama triangle. The right's truth is that only we are responsible for ourselves and our lives, and we have to have discipline and recognition of limitations. Its shadow is cold-heartedness, materialism, and looking after number one at the expense of other. Each has to play its role, but can we do it with humor and love whilst valuing the roles others are playing? Trump is playing a vital role in waking us up. I think, like Judas, he deserves a huge compassion and respect for being willing as a soul to play these difficult roles for all of our benefit.
Well, I think there's a lot in that, obviously. So I can't unpack all of it in
Yeah,
a linear way, but I can just sing a few things that occurred to me. I'll see which ones I can now remember. And
yeah.
are, one thing about it that I think is important, this idea of change or not change, is that there is both in England and America a tremendous difference in terms of political opinion, younger people compared to older. You know, if only people under 40 had voted, Brexit would have easily been defeated. If only people under 40 had voted, Trump would have been easily defeated. So, 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 to the extent that there's something changing in the Western societies, you know, or at least English-speaking ones, because I do think England and America are uncannily related. And of course, we came as
Yeah.
merged from the British Empire, and there's so much connectivity there. The extent that there's change coming, environmental, technological, population, who knows what else. Trump is represents resistance to change, not change. You know,
Mhm.
that to me is clear just based on that's where all the energy for him is from older people, not and all the energy against him is young. It's identical in England and America, that phenomenon. So it's Trump and the Boris Johnson thing. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing that I've been thinking a lot about, I'm trying to figure out what the next book to do. So I'm able to do it, but I've been thinking about the relation between art and politics. And I've been looking at sort of an 80-year period, kind of from 1940 to 2020.
Wow.
Because 1940 was the year Charles Chaplin made The Great Dictator, which to me was kind of the first liberal Hollywood big statement. There were some in the mid 30s that were kind of political, but The Great Dictator was a direct commentary on Hitler, obviously. And the speech that Chaplin makes, the first time he ever spoke in a movie, he was a silent film star before that, is about that. And so the one thing about going back and looking at different eras is how things that we think are so unique to this period. There's
Mm.
never been a time like the Trump era. There's never been a time like Brexit. This is unique because of the internet, because of social media. Nothing has ever been like this before. And that, I believe, is delusional. I think the fundamental emotional issues, fear versus hope, selfishness versus unselfishness, uh, coping with morality as a society, which is far more difficult than as individuals. All of these issues, racism, um, how to divide the wealth of a society. These are uncannily the same. One thing I discovered, and I know this may be a little bit off point, but it tweaks something in my brain that relates to this. Is so one of the things about Trump that we all were horrified by, those liberals of us, and I'm definitely in that category, self-righteous or not. Um, was when he said people are coming from Mexico is not sending us their best people, they're sending us rapists. And the image of the invading brown colored Spanish speaking people who were literally going to be violent rapists. So in 1798, John Adams wanted us, America, to side with to go to war against France in the wake of the French Revolution, and Jefferson was in favor of the French Revolution. And this was the big divide in America. Adams won one term, and then Jefferson won two. And we didn't, in fact, go get involved with that war between France and England. But when Adams was trying to, there were all these newspapers that were all like Fox News. You know, there was like the idea that the news has always been so objective. That's an anomaly. That was only in one period when we happened to have grown up. But in the 1800s, all the newspapers were partisan and made things up all the time. And in the pro Adams press, they had all these stories that French had invaded America, burned down American houses, raped American women, and killed their babies. Obviously, none of this happened. France never invaded the United States. We now know. But that was the propaganda then. Then in the 1930s, there's a socialist named Upton Sinclair running for governor of California. The Hollywood moguls are freaked out at the idea of him winning because he wanted to tax the movie studios. So they create newsreels, which again were the Fox News of the time. There was no television. So the only way people could see visual news, the most powerful thing was newsreels with actors and stock footage depicting Mexicans coming to America because Upton Sinclair invited them in and, being violent towards white people. So it's the same exact narrative in the 1798, 1934, 2016. And yet we're so convinced that our time is so unique and that no one's ever had to deal with some of these things. So there is something that's Maya-like, delusional about the notion that there's something so different about this time. I think the fundamental issues of spirituality, of fear, of compassion, of all of these different things transcend any particular time. It's like that, that idea of like now, I think is all that exists is like literally true.
But let me just say, in terms of the environment, though, we are at a critical mass point that is different.
There were a lot of things that are different. The nuclear age was genuinely different. When nuclear weapons, for the first time, physically, they were weapons that could destroy humanity. The environmental crisis is unique. The internet is unique. The quantity of people in the world is unique. I mean, there are all sorts of things that are particular to this time. But the deeper things that about love and about trying to and ethics. Then the third thing that came to mind, I'm sorry, to just another lane, is this word ethics. Because I've been thinking a lot about whatever these values come from, the opinions, should we should everybody be able to get health care, or can we just not afford it? And like some people just can't get it and die young, and the rest of us do well because that's the least bad thing in the kind of Darwinian notion of the strongest survive idea, and where do these ethical values come from? And they like exist on some other plane. They certainly don't come from religion, because you can have Christians that are very, very conservative and believe in Trump, and you have Christians that are pacifists and socialists. Same with Jews, same with Hindus, Muslims, same with atheists. So the spiritual definition that people have doesn't seem to imply any particular ethical side that one would be on. There's this other kind of discussion going on among human beings about ethics, and I've been trying to tune in on where does that reside? Where does that come from? Where does it reside? And like we're saying, how does art relate to it? But all I can say is this: I think that Ram Dass said something when Trump was first elected that I quote all the time, which was "resist with love."
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's still the answer. You've got to stand up for whatever your ethical belief is. And so my opinion is, more aligned with, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren than it is with Trump about the ethical way of interpreting what political and social policy should be. And you've got to love people you disagree with, or else you're adding to the problem. And it's easier said than done, but there's no question. So in terms of understanding who Trump is in the cosmology of the human race, I have no idea. That's like a intellectual capacity.
You know what I love most about, by the way, I should say that the gentleman who sent this along, who agreed that it would be fine to read, is Nick Oakley Smith. Okay. Thank you so much, Nick, because there are some provocative things in here. Yeah. Well written, well said. I guess what I vibe with is this notion of what he's doing, Trump, just by virtue of his incarnation, what he's doing and the actions he's taken, and they're creating an atmosphere where we really are able to look at our own darkness. I mean, superficially, maybe it's this, righteousness and we're right, they're wrong, polarized, looking at our own way in which he seems to be living in this polarized place. That seems very self-evident. and we are agreeing with him. Yes, we are that.
Well, I don't know what you mean.
Well, not agreeing. You know what I mean? We are following in that footstep by virtue of the anger and the separation that we feel towards whoever has voted for him, and whoever are his supporters. That I do feel like what he's doing is pointing us to dark spots inside ourselves. And I think that's
I
part
mean,
of what he's trying to say here.
yeah, I think I don't think that's unique to Trump. I mean, I think back in the George W. Bush administration, when the government of the United States had a policy of torturing people, and went to war for very dubious reasons, which to me never been justified. The amount of people that were killed in the Iraq War, the amount of people that were
Mm.
killed in the Vietnam War, were far, far greater quantity of people by a factor of thousands compared to the people killed during the Trump period. Not that I'm a fan of Trump, but I think the idea that he's uniquely playing that role is narcissistic about the time. There's been people play that same role throughout our lifetime. I certainly
Well, the nth degree is Hitler, right? The
well, that
nth
was
degree.
before my lifetime, but that was a
Yeah,
huge. I think Stalin wasn't particularly great.
yeah.
Now know about him, but in our lifetime in America, again, the Vietnam War to me was just look back on it. The more the time goes by, the more I look at that war, the more incomprehensible it is to me how, as a society, we did that. It had nothing to do with our security. I mean, today, Vietnam, we lost the war. Vietnam is a vacation place that Americans
Yeah.
go. It's like it didn't
It's
do any
insane.
harm at all.
Yeah.
The whole, and the number of people that died, it's unbelievably tragic. The 57,000 or so Americans who died and the hundreds of thousands who were wounded, traumatized, all that. But that's only a tiny fraction of the number of Vietnamese people who died for a war, the purpose of which I've never been able to hear anyone explain why, that was a good idea. And as far as I know from reading history, even if they went into it with good intentions in the middle of the Cold War and the struggle against communism, when they first started, because, they had some reason to worry about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had to, but by 68 or 67, I mean, all of the people in the Pentagon, McNamara, they all knew it was ridiculous. And yet it went on for another 4 years. So again, I think the idea of dealing with the Trump era for people who disagree with him politically, to me, is I'm all in favor of people voting, of people getting involved, of any kind of service to the society, to shine light and to defend people, particularly people that are oppressed by government policies such as immigrants or women or African American men walking down the street, worrying about cops or any of these things. But the idea that this is like some new problem that no one's ever had to deal with before is narcissistic. It's not true. These are the same moral and ethical issues that every generation of Americans have dealt with. I mean, my goodness, for the first 100 years, 90 years of the country, there was legal slavery. You want to talk about a dark time. I've just finished, a friend of mine has been written a series of books about the life of Abraham Lincoln. And I just read the one that's coming out in September, Sid Blumenthal. Incredible books if you like history, coming out, leading up to his election in 1860. In the 1850s, I mean, to be an abolitionist was to be considered a radical. I mean, Lincoln was constantly saying, "Oh, I'm not an abolitionist. I'm just against expanding, slavery into Kansas or whatever," because, and the fact that civilized, it wasn't that long ago. So, I think the human race has never had this utopian period. I think it's been this constant journey, and we're in part of the journey, and it's got particular qualities to it. One of which is this technology, one of which is global warming, and all these other things. But these moral and ethical issues, and how to get political outcomes that are more moral and humane, and how to love the people you disagree with, and to have humility in dealing with it. All of those things to me would have been the same 50 or 100 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, I got to push back. This man, and we're talking about the president, is so inhumane. He epitomizes the absolute darkest inhumane actions coming from such a a high level of complete ignorance, um, that that to me makes enough of a I mean, so this statement by Nick, this note by Nick, that he plays a vital role in waking us up like very few others have, I think is significant and is not, yes, in terms of historically, and what you're saying is absolutely true. But I think it's also true that this being has something in this incarnation that is he's powerful in his ability to embody these really inhumane actions. And I think that's a something that is different. I mean, you can George W. You can talk about. I mean, do you see that shit about Reagan? Apparently, he called Nixon, and just went on with like terrible epithets or racist epithets and so
Oh,
on.
yes, but Reagan started his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a city that was only known for one thing. There was no big factory in Philadelphia, and it had one historical distinction. It's where three civil rights workers were:
Mhm.
Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. And in his speech, he said, "The South shall rise again." It was a naked appeal to the Wallace votes and to racists. He called welfare mothers, he said they were welfare mothers with Cadillacs. You know, he was,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, he was, this idea, Reagan had a different style and frankly was a more effective politician than Donald Trump. He was much more popular than Donald Trump has ever been, and and
Mhm.
and got a lot. And there was not a very effective resistance to Reagan. There is at least a resistance to Trump. But what Reagan stood for was reducing school lunches, where they said ketchup was considered a vegetable. They had a law saying there was a minimum standard of
Yeah.
nutrition. You can go down, the list. So that to find out that privately he said a racist word to me is a lot less interesting than the result of those policies that weaken labor unions, and that he had a head of the environment, James Watt. You want to talk about global warming? James, you remember James Watt? James Watt was Nixon's Secretary of the Interior. And they said, "Are you worried about the planet?" It's not like in the 80s, people didn't know the environment was an issue. Earth Day starts in the 70s. We knew by the 80s that pollutants and, losing species, and there was an environmental crisis in the world. And James Watt said, "Well, I think the Lord is going to come back in my lifetime. So why should I worry about the environment?" That was the Secretary of the Interior. So talk about how could Nixon hire all these people? Look at this is not unique. I agree with the idea that we have to look inside ourselves for how our collective humanity creates these kind of leaders who are therefore on television and articulating these things, and to look inside ourselves and to learn from them and the role they play in consciousness. I don't disagree with any of that part of it. I do disagree in
Mhm.
in this exceptionalism of today.
Yeah.
That whatever it is today, we're
Mhm.
convinced no one ever is going through what we're going through. I'm sorry, slavery was worse. It really was. Women being able to vote was worse. And Vietnam
Mhm.
was worse. And I
Yeah.
think the Iraq war honestly was worse in terms of the amount of suffering that people in power, who American voters or the American system, it's not a democracy as we know, it's this republic where you can have a minority of the vote and still gain power through our complicated system of government. So I just don't like this exceptionalism because there's a certain byproduct of it that makes me feel uncomfortable.
Mhm.
I think honoring that it's all part of God's plan and to understand what we need to learn from it is a great lesson. And I think standing up for ethical values is vital if you're going to be a good person. And each person defines for themselves what that is. But I
Mhm.
putting children, separating children from their parents doesn't fit any kind of ethics I could
Yeah.
ever
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Trump didn't invent that ethical value system, unfortunately.
Yeah. For me, this whole thing boils down to how, because he talks about how each of us has a role to play. We each have a role.
Correct.
We are part of the whole. And how do we do it with humor and love while valuing the roles everyone is playing? That is the lesson of the Bible lesson of today. How do we do this with humor and love?
And if you got to pick one, go with love.
Well, I'm thinking,
Falls in the-
okay, here's a bald-faced commercial. Because when I think of humor and love, I think of Ram Dass. I think of this movie that we're putting out called Becoming Nobody, which is going to land in theaters in September. Everybody, go to becomingnobody.com and you'll see where it is going to land. You'll see the trailer and so on. But such an essential part of this movie is humor and love, and hopefully some of that will rub off on all of us. So that we can get our perspective a little more spacious around all of what's going on. And again, Danny, I always count on you to give us a little bit more of a wider perspective
I'll tell
on
you
on
this:
this.
if we're, I will just say that one of the things that I'm really inspired by are these young people that are in Congress.
Mm,
So,
mm. Or young people in general, yes, too.
people in general, absolutely. And AOC. I was talking to my son. He says like LeBron James. He gets into the NBA and immediately is the best player. And this is someone who I think
Mm,
quite brilliant. She's going to make a few mistakes and has made a few, but it's not just her. There's like 10 or 12 of them
yeah.
that to me can navigate in the modern world in a way that some of the older ones can't. We may have an older candidate, and I'm for whoever the Democrats nominate, no question about it. But I am a little excited by the younger energy.
That's great.
I really think they're gonna save us.
Okay. I I'm going to go along with that motion all the way because
But we got
unfortunately, as you know,
no matter what. I'm
yeah.
in love. I can't always find it in myself, but I want
But as you well know, I'm from Canada. I'm Canadian. So
fun.
how
Quebec. The big
Quebec,
Helen Collins.
je viens de Quebec, je suis Québécois. And I always say, well, if stupid things like, well, if he gets elected again, I'm going to go to Canada. I can't stay here another 4 years. So happens recently I met with a very close friend of mine who is the CEO of Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and which is a government agency, and she's in that circle. I said, "What do you think is going to happen in Canada with Trudeau and everything, who seems so uh, open and workable, caring kind of being?" She said, "No, he's going to be gone. We're looking at the next Trump for Canada. That's coming up next." I go, "Are you kidding? Where am I going to go?"
I
So
mean,
the truth is, there's nowhere to go.
well, there's nowhere to go, but there are. On one level, there's nowhere to go because we're always ourselves. But I think that the most right wing Canadian, still to the left of the left wing American.
I'll agree with that.
Okay,
I'll agree with that.
Trudeau's liberal or whatever you call the what is this party? The Labor? What's the party called that he's a part of?
No, it's a liberal party,
No. And then you had these other plenty of
conservative. Yeah,
but with even the most conservative prime ministers, you still had nobody with college debt of hundreds of thousands of dollars, no one with health care going bankrupt because of health care. You still had support for the arts, maybe better in some and less in others, but always better than the United States. So,
mm,
I don't know. It's the road not taken for me and for you, really, in terms of Canada. It's a pretty interesting society. I wish I knew a little more about it. I'm always
mm,
happy when I get to go there
mm.
for a few days.
Yeah.
and I always get there a few days a year, but
Yeah.
it's do you get home to Montreal much anymore?
Not much these days, because I'm oriented now out west, and with Ram Dass being in Maui and all of that. So yeah, not much, but I still have family there and so on. So I want everybody to know, Danny, that on the show notes page for this podcast, they will have links to not just this latest book with around Kurt and Nirvana, but other books that Danny has written, and also we'll put up a podcast or two from your podcast with Be Here Now Network days,
Well,
okay, from Rock and Roll.
lovely. One podcast, whatever you feel is appropriate is fine with me. And I miss doing the podcast. I just found it was, I ran out of people to talk to. I didn't find new people to talk to. I didn't have the beacon over my head that you do. But Paul Krasner passed away.
I know, and I saw you wrote a beautiful. The piece was beautiful.
And I did, I think, 2 podcasts with him. The very first one I did was
Oh, that's great.
and I did a second one with him. And the very first one I did though was with Paul. And the book In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, The Hippie Idea, which is kind of my subjective history of the year 1967. Not that I was part of it, but I was a fan of it. The year I graduated from high school is dedicated to Ram Dass, Wavy Gravy, and Paul Krasner.
That's so great.
So
Wow.
I mentioned Paul was a great being. Anyone who's not familiar with him, Google him, and it'll lead you to some interesting places.
I was back in the day when I was a program director for the radio station CKGM in Montreal, and I lived maybe 4 blocks from there in Westmount. And one day, knock on the door. I opened the door. It was Paul Krasner. I didn't know him from Adam. He was looking for me. He went to the station. They told him, "Yeah, no, here's his address. He's home." And then we sat down and talked for a long time. It was an amazing guy. Really amazing. Thank you for this.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. The thing about why those 3, certainly Ram Dass is in a category all of his own, but so many people out of the 60s became embittered or became tragic. They died young or they became grumpy as they got older. And those 3 to me, like good examples well into their 80s, just shining light, withstanding disappointments and external changes in their physical bodies, their status in the world. The light was a continual flow, and it's great to have examples like that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, again, thank you. Thank you for being here. This is a great chance to hang out and just do what we do normally, and then we'll share it out there. So thanks so much. Again, Mindrolling, BeHereNowNetwork.com, and you go to the show notes, and we'll lead you to all of this wonderful material. And we shall see you next week on Mindrolling.